All right, welcome to today's lecture. So today we're going to get started with our unit, our 3-day long unit, looking at policy interventions for development. So what we're going to do today is first I'm going to briefly review some of the key themes of the course. What have we been doing so far, and how does that differ from what we're doing now? Then I'm going to talk about some key ideas that we need to keep in mind, thinking about how we actually evaluate policy interventions. So how do we evaluate the quality of an intervention? What kinds of things do we need to pay attention to? And so just to preview what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about the assumptions made by different kinds of policy interventions and look at systematic ways to see whether those assumptions actually hold true. And that's kind of what Banerjee and Duflo are trying to do in the book that you all have read. We're also going to talk about poverty traps. So what do people mean when they say there's a poverty trap? And finally, we're going to talk about hunger. So what are different kinds of policy interventions for hunger? What kinds of assumptions do they make about the nature of the problem? And how well do they work based on the evidence that we're seeing from Banerjee and Duflo? So our approach so far has been to focus on one big question. Why does this map look the way it does? Why are some places poor and other places rich? Okay, so we've been focusing on big causal explanations for this big pattern. Things like, the first one that we learned was slavery. So, um, so maybe that slavery causes countries to be less developed through mechanisms like population loss, mistrust, and things like that. So, why is this question useful? Well, it's certainly interesting. It's certainly one way we could try to understand one of the biggest patterns that we see in the world. One of the biggest things determining why the world looks the way it does. And so, certainly it's interesting, but why is it useful? So it may be useful because some of these things, like if we think that institutions, for example, matter for development, then maybe we could make recommendations about how to change institutions, things like that. But are the answers always useful? So think back to when we looked at the natural world and geography. If it's something like the presence of certain plant and animal species thousands and thousands of years ago that causes the patterns of development that we see today, that may not be very useful because we can't change that past, right? Or even if it's something like culture. If we think, if we're culturalists and we think culture explains why some countries are richer than others or have developed more quickly than others, culture may be hard to change. It's certainly not impossible to change, but it might be hard to change. So the answers sometimes will be useful, sometimes they won't be very useful. Um, and and I guess another thing I'd say is we may never find the big answer. We may never really know why some countries are rich and others are poor. You all probably think that some of the theories we've looked at are more plausible than others. They have more merit than others. And so it may be that geography explains part of that variation, and part of it's explained by institutions, and part of it's explained by culture. Um, it doesn't have to be the case that one of these theories fully answers our question. And even if we never find that big answer, even if we can never um, eliminate poor countries, we can never bring all the poor countries up to our level, there is still a lot being done to try to help poor individuals and communities. And I'm not just talking about foreign aid, because LDC governments um, are doing a lot on their own. In fact, the majority of, of efforts to help the poor in LDCs are done by LDC governments themselves. For example, the government of India providing free grain to the rural poor in many states, as you all read about in Banerjee and Duflo. So as we go through this book and this approach, I'll talk about aid just to mean interventions that are meant to help the poor. It doesn't have to be foreign aid necessarily. Sometimes the source of the money or the planning might be a foreign one, but oftentimes it's not, and the distinction there is not super important for what we're trying to do here. So even if we can never know why some countries are rich and others are poor, we can people are still making efforts to try to prevent preventable diseases like malaria and waterborne diseases. People are still trying to get infrastructure to the poor in LDCs. We can still try to make sure that the poor can start a business if they want to. And so various actors are intervening to try to improve the lives of the poor. NGOs building and operating free clinics in villages, governments providing subsidized or free grain to the poor, microcredit lenders providing credit to the poor to allow them to start businesses. But just because something's being done to help poor people doesn't mean it's the right thing. Just because something's being done does not mean that progress is being made. So what we're going to learn to do is to evaluate policy interventions for poverty. And in doing so, we're going to learn a lot about the nature of the problems that the poor face. So that's a kind of added benefit of what we're doing. We're not just learning a skill of evaluating these interventions, but they're also going to teach us a lot about the nature of the problems themselves and about the people. So there are a number of questions that we need to ask, and these are small questions. Rather than the big question of why countries are rich or poor, we're going to learn to ask a number of small questions. So first of all, what is the real problem? When we're talking about food, is it a lack of calories? Is it a lack of micronutrients? What is it? Is the problem a poverty trap? So we will talk in a minute about what a poverty trap is. Actually, I'll just do it now. So, I'll wait for that. Sorry, keep changing my mind. So, but we will try to figure out whether certain problems are a poverty trap, and you've already been doing that in the reading you've done in the Banerjee and Duflo book. Third, how will the poor respond to the intervention? So, if you subsidize grains, will they buy more grains, or will they not buy more grains? The answer to that is actually not totally straightforward. And finally, does the intervention actually solve the problem you're trying to solve? So those are the small questions we always need to be asking. And we'll also be trying to understand and question the assumptions that an intervention makes. So any intervention is going to make a number of assumptions. So when I say on this slide the intervener, I mean whoever is designing and implementing the intervention. Maybe it's a foreign actor, maybe it's a government, maybe it's an NGO, a local NGO. If someone's providing free grain to the poor, then they are an intervener. So in taking that action of providing free grain or providing an immunization camp in a certain rural area or something like that, any action is going to rely upon a number of assumptions. So first of all, the intervener needs to assume what the real problem is, right? So if they're providing free grain, they're probably assuming that the problem is simply a lack of calories. Second, they need to assume that the poor will respond to the intervention in a particular way. If you're providing free grain, you're assuming, and you think the problem is a lack of calories, you're assuming that if you provide free grain, the poor will eat more grain. Okay, the intervener might also assume that there is a poverty trap. So this idea of a poverty trap that we'll come back to a little later on in this talk means that there's some vicious cycle wherein poverty creates a problem and that problem reinforces poverty. So for example, if we believed that the poor cannot afford enough calories to work productively, so we should provide them with subsidized grains so they can eat more calories and get out of this poverty trap. So the idea here behind this caloric poverty trap that Banerjee and Duflo talk about is that people are so deprived of calories that they can't work productively. Because they can't work productively, they stay poor. And because they stay poor, they can't afford to eat more calories. So it's a vicious cycle, right? Poverty traps are always vicious cycles. Now it's important to question all these assumptions because whether a intervention can be effective depends on whether these assumptions are true, whether they generally represent reality. And no assumption is going to hold true for every person or every community or every context because the world is complicated, but do they generally hold true, right? So how are we going to evaluate assumptions? So first of all, we just need to always identify what they are. If we think that there's a caloric poverty trap, what are the underlying assumptions? That's what Banerjee and Duflo were doing for a lot of the chapter, is identifying the underlying assumptions behind that seemingly simple idea. So first, we identify what the assumptions are, and then we need to think hard about the theory and mechanisms at play. Do those assumptions seem true? But even more important, we need to look at empirical data. And so Banerjee and Duflo are looking at empirical data from household surveys and other kinds of sources to investigate whether the patterns they find in the data are consistent with those assumptions. And then next, they rely upon these randomized controlled trials, which are a very powerful tool, and what they are used for is measuring the effectiveness of an intervention. Does it actually have an effect? So RCTs are really experiments, okay? So they are a research design that relies upon a randomly assigned treatment and control condition, just like you learned about in high school science class. So they really are the most powerful way to assess the effect of something. And in our case, a treatment is going to be some kind of intervention meant to help the poor in some way, meant to give them more calories or get them to vaccinate their kids or something like that. So how these are done is you take a group of people who might be the potential targets of an intervention. So say it's an intervention to give people free grain. You take a sample of people who are the kind of poor people who would typically be the target of that kind of intervention. And then you randomly choose a set of those people to get the intervention, to get the free grain, and the rest do not get it. And then you measure the outcomes. So maybe we're interested in people's calorie consumption. So if you give people free grain, do they eat more calories? Then you take this group of people, you randomly assign some people or some households, it could be, to get the free grain, and some do not, and that's chosen randomly. That's very important. And then after that, you measure the difference between those two groups. Did the randomly assigned group, the treatment group that got the free grain, did they eat more calories than the other people? So why do we do it this way? Well, because if we're not randomly assigning these interventions, it's actually hard to measure the effects of these interventions. So this is a really important idea, so I'm going to go into some detail here. So let's take the example of a different kind of intervention in the US. Let's take the example of a tutoring program in a middle school. And let's say that about 10% of students in the school go to this after-school tutoring program. And they get extra help on math and reading and stuff like that. Now, the purpose of this program is to make kids better at reading and math. But how do we know how much the program is really helping them? Well, we could have all the students in the school take a standardized test and see if the students in the tutoring program are better or worse than those who are not in the program. But what kinds of problems would we run into? Well, maybe the kids are in the tutoring program because they were doing poorly, and so their parents or teachers signed them up for it. And so it may be that you see these students doing more poorly than everyone else, and you think, wow, this tutoring is actually having a negative effect on them. But it's not. They were just starting from a lower place in terms of their achievement or their learning. And maybe they're actually better off than they would have been if they had not enrolled in the program. Or maybe on the other side, the students who are in this tutoring program just have very concerned parents, and maybe those parents are doing all kinds of other things, like enrolling them in all kinds of other extra educational activities to try to make them, to try to improve their performance. And so maybe you see these students doing a lot better because of all that stuff, but not because of the tutoring program. So the problem that you run into is the two groups, the students who get the intervention and the students who do not, are not comparable. But if you randomly assigned that 10% of students in the school to get the tutoring program, if you randomly selected them, then that group should be no different on average than the other group. There should be no systematic differences if it's like a lottery and students are chosen that way, randomly. It's like a controlled experiment. And so then you really could compare the two groups. If the treatment is really assigned randomly, you could compare those two groups, and any difference that you see, in that case, when the treatment is assigned randomly, should be due only to the treatment itself and not to any systematic differences, because those systematic differences should not happen. They could arise based on random chance, but it's not likely. So there's these research designs, these RCTs, are really powerful in terms of measuring the causal effects of things on other things. And there's a lot of interest in academia and government, and especially in the aid community, in learning how to use RCTs to make aid work better. So we all know the problems of evaluation in the aid community, but the aid community is trying to get better. It's trying to do more evaluation to make sure that their programs are actually working. And so there's been an explosion of these RCTs in aid because the same problems that you just heard about with those students in the tutoring program happen with aid. Aid projects often go to communities or individuals who are poorer than everyone else, and so they're not doing as well in terms of health and education or whatever we're looking at. And so it may be hard to sort out the effect of this intervention by simply comparing them to everyone else or to the people who don't get the intervention. Sometimes, on the other hand, aid projects might go to communities that are doing better in some ways than others. Maybe they are communities with good governance, or communities that are more peaceful and have less conflict. So we need to do some of these RCTs if we want to actually know what the effects of an aid intervention are. So poverty traps. You read about them in Banerjee and Duflo. Basically, the idea, as I already said, of a poverty trap is that there's some kind of self-reinforcing vicious cycle. So I already kind of explained what they are. The caloric poverty trap is one example. So maybe poor people can't afford to eat enough calories to be productive, and that low productivity in turn keeps them poor. We could think about a health poverty trap. Maybe uh, poor people are more exposed to certain illnesses and diseases because they can't afford good care or good protection from those things or good nutrition that protects them from those things. And those illnesses make them less productive or um, or keep them from using their incomes more productively because they're spending money on these illnesses, and then that keeps them poor, which in turn reinforces their poor health. So why do we care so much about poverty traps? Well, we care so much about them because where they're true, it means that people are really powerless to help themselves. It means that poverty is going to persist unless there's some big push, some infusion of cash or resources or something to push people out of this vicious cycle. So it's not a poverty trap if people can get out of it. If they can get out of it, then it's not a poverty trap. It's something else. So this doesn't mean that. So first of all, if there is a poverty trap, that really justifies some kind of aid or some kind of intervention. Now that doesn't mean that if there's no poverty trap, there's no point in helping people. Uh, Oftentimes, many people could use some help, even if they're not um, hopelessly trapped in this vicious cycle. But where there is a poverty trap, that suggests that that's especially a situation where people need help. So this idea of poverty traps has been picked up by the aid community. So aid boosters like Jeffrey Sachs think that there are poverty traps. They're big believers in poverty traps, and they use the idea of poverty traps to advocate big pushes, spending more on aid to get people out of the trap. Whereas aid skeptics tend not to believe in poverty traps and think that because there aren't poverty traps, people can help themselves, and we should simply leave them to do that. We should simply let them help themselves. So we talked in the geography chapter about the tropical disadvantage, tropical diseases, and low agricultural productivity keeping countries poor. That's a poverty trap, right? And that's a poverty trap that people like Jeffrey Sachs, Saxon Warner, are very interested in because they think if there's a big push in terms of spending on controlling these diseases and making agriculture more productive, countries can lift themselves out of these poverty traps. So there can be a poverty trap either at the level of the country or the individual or household. Now, the poverty traps that Banerjee and Duflo are usually talking about are at the individual or household level. So I just want to say that this idea of poverty traps, even though it's been picked up by the pro-aid, anti-aid debate, I think kind of transcends that debate. Even if there aren't poverty traps, I don't think that means there's no point in helping. And even if there are poverty traps, I don't think that means that the answer is always just to spend more without regard to how that money is spent. So I think that whether there is or is not some poverty trap is not the be-all, end-all of this debate, because oftentimes this debate is about a lot of other things, like corruption and ideas of aid dependency and things like that, things that have nothing to do with poverty traps per se. And it's also kind of a moral debate and a philosophical debate about, is it our job to help other people? And as I already said, when we look at this stuff, a lot of this stuff is not foreign aid related. So Banerjee and Duflo don't care a whole heck of a lot about this pro-aid, anti-aid debate. They're interested in smaller but frankly more immediately important questions. because much of the aid that's being done to help the poor is not foreign aid. And even if there's no foreign aid, there will still be things being done by domestic actors to try to help the poor. And so it's still important to understand when those projects can work and when they won't. So here's a picture of Banerjee and Duflo. So they wrote your book, Poor Economics. Their view of the poverty trap is that it probably exists in some contexts and not in others. So we should identify what the poverty traps are that we think there are. Caloric poverty traps, or poverty traps related to micronutrients, or health poverty traps, or things like that, and systematically try to figure out whether they exist or not. Whereas people like Sachs and Warner are just kind of promoting the idea of poverty traps, and people like Dambisa Moyo and Easterly simply don't believe in the idea of poverty traps. Banerjee and Duflo take a more scientific approach. There should be poverty traps in some cases and not in others, and we should go looking for them. So they founded this lab at MIT called the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, or JPAL. And JPAL is kind of one of the leading, or probably the leading lab promoting the use of RCTs, of randomized controlled trials, to study development interventions. And so the focus of their work is often on the kinds of small questions that we saw earlier. Not why are some countries rich and others are poor, but does this specific kind of project work in most cases? Or does the assumption underlying the idea of a caloric poverty trap hold true when we look at the actual data? So their approach is really interesting because not only is it very systematic and very rigorous, but it also looks at it in great detail, kind of unpacks the real conditions that people face on the ground. They're really trying to understand the problems of poverty from the ground, not from above, from the perspective of the poor who deal with these issues every day. And so they are also trying to understand, so they're trying to understand the context that the poor live in, the social contexts and the economic contexts and the choices that they have to make every day. So they're big on understanding the choices that the poor are forced to make. They're also interested in understanding the behavior and decision making of the poor in developing countries. Now, I don't think they think that the poor necessarily behave any differently than us, any better or worse or more or less rationally. I think that they think the poor are people just like us. And so people are generally know a lot about their own problems and about their own context. They generally know what the right moves are and how to improve their situation, but they're not perfect. So people aren't perfect decision makers. They tend to try to do things to improve their situation and to make their lives better, but we can't expect them to always have perfect knowledge or perfect decision making around these things. And you guys certainly saw that in the hunger chapter, that sometimes when people are given an extra amount of money that they could use to alleviate their hunger, they might spend it on something they don't really need. So these flaws that Banerjee and Duflo point out in the decision making of the poor, first of all, sometimes they're not flaws. Sometimes it's our problem and we misunderstood what the actual problem was that the poor were facing. But sometimes they are wrong decisions. Sometimes the poor could do something differently and make themselves better off. And that doesn't make them any worse than us, that just makes them human. So Banerjee and Duflo are interested in taking this behavioral approach to the study of these development interventions, which is kind of part of the advantage of this book that you all read, right? And the other advantage, I would say, is the focus on the evidence generated by RCTs. So that's a picture of them. They are a couple now. Um, they're married and they have a kid. They're basically they're basically the Jay-Z and Beyonce of development studies. So here's a picture of them. I just love that picture. They just look really happy in this art museum. So we talked about the general approach. So let's talk about today's substantive topic, and it's hunger. So the World Health Organization thinks that hunger is the single greatest threat to global public health. So there may be as many as 1 billion people in the world who are not getting enough food to eat. Maybe like these kids who are eating trash on the street in Pakistan. And there are a number of problems that follow from being hungry and malnourished that we've already talked about. But just to review, things like child mortality, things like maternal mortality, or susceptibility to infectious diseases. That's something that you all read about, right? So the malnutrition kind of depressing your immune system and making you more prone to infectious diseases. We could think about impaired brain development and poor achievement in school. So malnutrition in childhood, or when a fetus is developing and the mother is poorly nourished, that can impair brain development, and that can lead to cognitive difficulties or poor achievement in school that could last throughout a person's entire life. So that actually that could affect their that effect could accumulate over the course of their life in a big difference in kind of how much they earn because of that impaired brain development. So Banerjee and Duflo really go after this conventional wisdom that there's some kind of calorie deficiency that is a poverty trap. So this conventional wisdom is basically that you need a certain number of calories in order to work productively, right? So you eat a certain number of calories per day, and the vast majority, even if you're exercising a lot, the vast majority of the calories that you eat are just spent on your body kind of maintaining its metabolism and stuff like that, on your body just existing and repairing itself, right? Just kind of keeping you alive. And so whatever calories you have left over are available for your work and moving around and activity and stuff like that. And so the idea behind this calorie deficiency poverty trap is that if you're hungry, if you're deprived of calories, then that will make you lethargic and weak. And so because you're lethargic and weak, you can't be productive at work. You can't work as hard or as fast or for as long. And so because of that, you maybe will make less money. And then because you're making less money, you can't afford as much food. And so it's just a self-reinforcing cycle. And so based in part on this idea, one of the most common types of interventions has been to provide free or subsidized grain to the poor. So for example, in 2008 to 2009, Egypt spent almost $4 billion subsidizing grain, 2% of its GDP, subsidizing grain to try to make grain more affordable to the poor. We could think about the Rakshin program, where Indonesia distributes subsidized rice to the poor, or free rice provided monthly at a highly subsidized price to the rural poor in Orissa, India. So these are all interventions that are meant to really boost the amount of calories that the poor are getting. And so that seems like a good thing to do if we think that the calorie poverty trap is real. But is it real? That's what we're going to ask today. So this is Pak Solheim. So you guys read about him in the Banerjee and Duflo chapter, and this is a picture of him. He's a villager in West Java, Indonesia. And basically his story is that he got laid off from his job, and so he believes that he can only afford a small amount of rice per week and whatever fish he can catch. And so he believes that because he's not eating very much, he's tired all the time. And so because he's so tired, he has even more trouble working and getting back on his feet. And so he's even more hungry. And so the cycle continues. So when he's describing his situation to Banerjee and Duflo, he's describing this calorie poverty trap. So what kinds of assumptions are we making if we think that the calorie poverty trap is real? So let's say the calorie poverty trap is real. We have to make a number of assumptions about it. And let's say that providing more rice or more noodles or more calories to people like Pak Solheim is the answer that will get them out of that poverty trap. If we think that's the answer, that's the solution, then what kinds of assumptions are we making? So the assumption we're making, if we think that subsidized grain or free grain or free calories are the answer, is that the assumption we're making is that if the poor are made richer or calories are made cheaper, the poor will buy more calories. Or say maybe our solution is just give poor people money and they'll buy more calories and get out of the poverty trap. We're still making this assumption. So Banerjee and Duflo point out the fact that, well, they point out actually a few facts here that are really important. First of all, they point out that we're assuming that people are spending as much money as they possibly can on calories. If we think the poor are caught in a calorie poverty trap, then they should be spending as much as they can on calories, right? We also would be assuming that that if we increase their spending on calories, then their income will increase, right? So both of these assumptions underlie this solution, because the solution can't be to make those calories more affordable or more available to people if they already have the money to buy them, right? And the solution can't work unless an increase in the purchasing power of the poor translates into an increase in the number of calories they're buying. So Banerjee and Duflo, as you all read, examine these very assumptions, and they don't find that they hold true. So let's look at this assumption. If the poor are made richer or calories are made cheaper, the poor will buy more calories. Actually, the evidence that they find is that the poor can often buy significantly more calories if they cut back on luxuries, things like alcohol, tobacco, other things. So they look at this survey evidence from India and find that even people who report being hungry buy things that they certainly don't need. Okay? So maybe they're not in a calorie poverty trap after all. Or maybe simply increasing their buying power won't get them out of it. We also see in the Subramanian and Deaton article, the evidence from India that you guys read, that when the extremely poor get a 1% income increase, their spending on food only increases by about 0.67%. Okay? So, like, if you're caught in a calorie poverty trap and your income goes up by 1%, and you're aware of the poverty trap you're in, your spending on food should increase by at least 1%. If it's going elsewhere, that suggests that maybe that extra income is not getting you out of the poverty trap. Or maybe you're not in that poverty trap to begin with. We also see this RCT in China that Banerjee and Duflo talk about, where people were randomly assigned to get grain subsidies, subsidized grains or noodles. And when the poor got these subsidies, they actually consumed less grain. So if you give someone a subsidy, let's say they're a hungry person or a poor household, if you give them a subsidy for grain, the assumption you're making is that that will cause them to buy more grain. But in fact, in this study, the poor consumed less grain. So why is that? Well, what we think, or what we don't really know why that happened, but when Banerjee and Duflo think, and what the authors of this study thought, is that there's some psychological effect that occurs where when you give people this subsidy, they have more buying power, and so they feel more rich. And so they want something more expensive that's more of a luxury, that tastes better. And so they buy more meat or shrimp or something like that. So if you give them more buying power, more money, free grains, or a grain subsidy, they're not necessarily buying more grain. They view that as freeing up more money for other things that are more expensive and tastier. So the last point speaks to the fact that a poor person's budget is fungible. So remember we talked about fungibility in government budgets? Well, a poor person's budget is fungible too. If you make grain cheaper for them, they could buy more grain, or they could buy the same amount and spend that savings on something tasty, but without as much calories per dollar spent. Shrimp or sugar or sugary tea or something like that. Or they could even spend it on luxury things. And so, that might be an understandable choice, but that means that you're probably not getting them out of the calorie poverty trap that way. Now, Banerjee and Duflo mentioned that in many villages in India that they surveyed, the product that gives you the most bang for the buck is millet. That has most calories per dollar spent. So, of course, then, when you give a poor person a little more money, they will probably spend it all on millet, right? Well, no. The answer is they don't. Why? Well, have you eaten millet recently? And the answer is no. Not because you can't find it in the store, you can, but because it tastes awful. And the poor don't have different taste buds than us. So it may not always be the case that these simple subsidies or giving even goods or money will actually translate into an increase in the amount of grains that people are eating. They may not always go for the thing that's the biggest bang for their buck in terms of calories. The second assumption that we're making is that the poor cannot afford enough calories to be productive. So if the caloric poverty trap is true, the cost of a healthy amount of calories must be out of reach for those living in extreme poverty. Now, Subramanian and Deaton hit back hard against this assumption and say basically, when we look at the costs of things in India and the amount of money that even the extremely poor have, it's actually very cheap to buy enough calories for one day for a person. Assuming they spend that money on the cheaper kinds of goods, grains and stuff like that. That's very cheap to do. Calories in many parts of the world are actually really cheap. And so for example, Banerjee and Duflo looked at the Philippines and the cost of different goods in the Philippines. And they found that a person could buy an adequate number of calories for a day's work for very little. That cost of a day's worth of calories was within reach of just about everyone. But people would have to eat like bananas and eggs all the time. And so people often are not going to do that. They're not going to seek out those ways to get the cheapest calories. But nonetheless, it certainly seems like in a lot of these places that Banerjee and Duflo looked at in the reading that you guys did, and in the Indian example of Subramanian and Deaton, it's not always very expensive to get a day's worth of calories. And remember, like one of the central pillars of this calorie poverty trap idea is that the poor cannot afford enough calories. Let's see. I already said all this. So this is just two things from the readings that you guys did to illustrate this idea, including a quote from the Subramanian and Deaton article where they say, in these Indian data, the calories necessary for a day's activity cost less than 5% of the daily wage, which makes it implausible that income is constrained by nutrition rather than the other way around. And I bolded this last part because it's important. If nutrition is a trap, it is one from which there is a ready escape. So they don't really think that there's this calorie poverty trap. And Banerjee and Duflo are on the same page with them. They think that in many places, the cost of a well-balanced 2,400 calorie diet is well within the budget of someone living in extreme poverty. Okay, the third assumption that we're making, if we believe in this idea of this poverty trap, is that the poor will make more money if they're more productive. If this guy driving this rickshaw in China was more productive, if he drove his rickshaw more and faster or something like that, if he had the energy to do his job more, then he would make more. And so if the calorie poverty trap is true, the poor must achieve a payoff from working that is proportional to their effort. It must, if this trap is real, it must be the case that the more you work, the more you get, and the less you work, the less you get in terms of income. So that seems pretty straightforward. But once again, Banerjee and Duflo do not agree with this. So there are a few reasons. So this might often be the case. They don't think that this is never the case, but they think that for some poor people, their income is not proportional to their effort. So they point out that many jobs do not reward workers proportionally to the amount of effort they exert. So many, if you're a shopkeeper or something like that, there are many jobs where the amount of energy you have is not going to enable you to do more physical work and then make more money. But there are some jobs. And so one interesting piece of evidence they see is that in Indonesia, workers that are not self-employed are less likely to see a payoff from increased productivity than workers that are self-employed. But perhaps more interestingly, they looked at survey evidence of people from the Philippines. So you all read about this. And what they saw is that there are these workers who sometimes do piecework and sometimes they don't. And so piecework is where they're paid by the unit produced. Maybe they're making garments or something like that. And maybe sometimes they're getting paid by the unit produced, and sometimes they're doing other kinds of work where they're not doing piecework, where they're not paid in accordance with their output. And people tend to eat more on days when they expect to work if they're doing piecework, right? So if they're doing piecework, they'll eat more on their working days than they do on their not working days. Whereas if they're not doing piecework, if they're not paid by the amount of effort exerted, they don't eat more on their work days. So this suggests that this assumption holds true sometimes and not other times, right? So some kinds of work, people are rewarded for increased productivity, and other kinds they are not. And actually, this last piece of evidence from the Philippines suggests that the poor are aware of this. They're aware of how their food consumption might impact their productivity, and so they plan for that. Of course, you could also say maybe they're eating more on their work days because their work just makes them more hungry because they're working harder. So I don't know the details of how that was measured enough to know if that's the case, but it is kind of cool to think that maybe people are planning in this way. So what Banerjee and Duflo have done in this chapter is really knock down some of the most important assumptions underlying the calorie poverty trap. So just to kind of recap what we've said about this, the first idea is that the poor are going to spend more on calories if their spending power increases. And Banerjee and Duflo show that sometimes people don't do that. In fact, often they don't do that. They spend more on less nutritious type of foods that taste better. They spend more on luxuries or on festivals or on televisions or things like that. So even if they're in some kind of calorie poverty trap, you may not get them out of it by giving them the opportunity to buy more calories. So that's not to blame the victim. It's just to show the complexities and the imperfections of human behavior and how that can undermine some of our best efforts to help people. So the poor are very much like us. They want to live not only healthy lives and be well nourished, but they also want to live enjoyable lives. And so they might be sometimes spending money on things that they don't really need, but that make their lives less boring or more tolerable. They might not always buy the healthiest foods. Sometimes they might buy the things that taste really good, you know? And so it certainly seems like that that could undermine certain efforts to get the poor more calories. They also really knock down the assumptions that the poverty trap exists in the first place. They don't think necessarily that everyone's income is constrained by the number of calories that they have. They don't think that the adequate number of calories is actually unaffordable to most poor people. And both of those things have to be the case if there's a calorie poverty trap. Okay, so they think that this idea of the calorie poverty trap is a real simplification of what the real realities are for the poor. That there isn't really this simple calorie poverty trap that we thought there was. But they don't think that hunger is not a problem. So first of all, they go to great lengths to show that hunger as a child or hunger for mothers when a fetus is developing are very important in terms of that individual's long-term outcomes, right? So people who grow up being well nourished and whose mothers are well nourished when that person is before that person is born, those people tend to grow up to be healthier, and they tend to grow up to do better in school, and eventually that translates into differences in income. Those people tend to make more money, and so that's not really the simple kind of calorie poverty trap that people had talked about, but it is important. So Banerjee and Duflo don't think that hunger isn't a problem. And so, furthermore, they think that micronutrients and deworming are really important, especially for pregnant women and children. So there may not be this simple poverty trap, and the kind of simplifying assumptions that these other people have made maybe don't hold true when we look at the evidence, but that doesn't mean that nothing can be done. So first of all, as I said, Banerjee and Duflo are saying that childhood hunger is something that we should be focusing on. And so they think that deworming kits are a really important tool for this. So intestinal worms are a major parasite infecting people and infecting children in some countries, especially in parts of Africa. And so, among other things, these parasites are sucking away nutrients from the food that the people are eating. So people are malnourished in part because the worms are basically eating up all of their food right out of their intestines. And so deworming meds can effectively kill these worms, and they're fairly cheap. And which means that if some kids get these deworming kits or these deworming medications, they can be better nourished during the critical time in their lives, that is their childhood. And so they'll do better in school, and that'll have lasting effects on their earning potential. And then Banerjee and Duflo point to the importance of these micronutrients. So one thing is iodine during pregnancy. So when women don't get enough of this nutrient during pregnancy, that can impair a child's development if the woman is pregnant, so that the child doesn't do as well in school later in life. But iodine is very cheap. It's very cheap to provide iodized salt. And salt is something that tastes good. And we already know the poor, just like us, they want to eat good tasting foods. And so simply iodizing salt and making iodized salt available so that when people buy salt, they are buying iodized salt, or they have the option to buy iodized salt. That's not expensive. It's not hard to do. But that can address this one important problem. Similarly, iron supplements. So iron deficiency causes anemia, which can make people weak and tired. So maybe there is some kind of, not really a poverty trap there, but it could have an effect similar to this idea that people had talked about with the poverty trap, where people are not eating enough of, in this case, iron to be productive. They're weak and tired and they can't work as hard. But even more importantly, anemia can be very dangerous or deadly for pregnant women. And so one solution that's been used in certain countries is to fortify salt with iron. So fortifying salt not just with iodine and with iron, but also with iron. And to fortify fish salt with iron. It's easy and cheap, and again, we're adding it to tasty things that people want to eat. So Banerjee and Duflo give the example of fortified fish salt in Indonesia. A year's supply of fish sauce, or sorry, I said fortified fish salt, I meant fish sauce. So a year's supply of this fish sauce costs $7. But a worker who uses it, it's estimated that they can make $46 more from the productivity gains that they would get from not being iron deficient. So they spend $7 to get $46 more than they would make otherwise throughout the year. So that seems like a good investment. So because they're anemic, they aren't anemic, they can work harder. That seems like a good investment. It pays for itself pretty quickly. But the poor don't always make these smart financial decisions. Not because they're different from everyone else, but because they're just like everyone else. So Banerjee and Duflo point out that even though this fortified fish sauce is a good investment for people, people either aren't aware of it or they focus more on the short-term cost of $7 rather than the long-term payoff. And we all do that. we're all going to focus more on the short-term costs and benefits than the long-term. That's easier for us. And so that's a justification that Banerjee and Duflo give for maybe providing this fish sauce for free. Maybe that's the intervention that should be done. Provide free iron-fortified fish sauce because people are not going to buy it on their own necessarily. And it has this big effect on the quality of people's lives, on their health and their earnings, and it's fairly cheap. So it seems like a safe bet. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up what we did today. But now I'm going to talk about your presentations. So I'm just going to briefly talk about this. So remember, you all are presenting your project ideas. So you've been working on this paper. By this time, you've probably already turned in your proposal or are about to do so. And so on Thursday and Friday of next week, you're all going to present your research. And so your paper doesn't need to be done by that time. It does not need to be. All you need is basically to have done a lot of your research by then, to know what your theory is and what kind of evidence you're going to bring to bear and how you're going to show that your theory holds true in your country. So remember, we learned all these theories as to why some countries are rich and others are poor, and you're going to use one country to demonstrate the truth of that theory, basically. So this person thinks that, remember, we learned these theories about colonialism and the bad effects it has had on development in some places. And so this person, for their project, argued that it was the legacy of colonialism that impeded development in Haiti. So this is their PowerPoint presentation. So at the beginning, you can always give a little overview of what you're going to do in the presentation, of what the different parts of the presentation are. So this person is going to give a brief overview of the status of human and economic development in Haiti. They're going to talk about their theory. What is the theory, the legacy of colonialism? Then they'll talk about the evidence, why it explains underdevelopment in Haiti. They'll talk about a number of alternative theories, and then they'll have a question and answer session. And so this is a pretty small number of slides. I think this one is maybe 8 slides. And we're looking at short presentations, not more than 10 minutes. So for the first section, this person just gave some figures. So what is the GDP per capita in Haiti in this case 2 different years? So last year was 2016, and they also gave it in 1991 to show how much it's changed over time. And this is really important. They're not just showing that, because that number by itself is not that meaningful. They're comparing it to something else. So either the global average between all countries, or maybe more interestingly in this case, the median in that region, in the Caribbean. So not just what is the GDP per capita of Haiti, that's just a number, but how does it compare to other Caribbean countries? That's more interesting. Okay, so they're doing the same thing with infant mortality rates and with literacy rates. So not just economic development, but also human development. How do we know that Haiti has had some problems with development? Well, here's some evidence, right? Here's what we mean when we say that it's a less developed country. And remember, the key here is we're comparing it to other countries. So, oops, I think I skipped a slide. So, on this slide, there's evidence for this colonial legacy in Haiti. So remember, you're going to talk about what your theory is. So in this case, so what is the theory connecting colonial legacies to underdevelopment. So you talk about things like extractive institutions and stuff like that, right? So you talk about, in abstract, like the theoretical things that we talked about with that topic. And then you talk about the evidence for that theory for this country. So in this case, he's showing here that, first of all, Haiti was a colony, so that's important. But more interestingly, like, what were the institutions, the extractive institutions that were set up? Um, what was their colonial drain? So like he here is going to be talking about kind of evidence specific to Haiti that these things that we talk about with this colonial legacy theory were occurring in Haiti. That's the idea here. So explaining what the theory is, but also how it applies to your country. That's this middle part. Now remember, we always acknowledge what the alternative theories are. So he's acknowledging that there are two other plausible theories that people might use to explain underdevelopment in Haiti. In this case, slavery and bad geography. And so he's giving a little bit of evidence, not as much, but a little bit for each of these alternative theories. So you don't have to spend the same amount of time on your each alternative theory as you did with your main one. That would be excessive. You're just going to briefly summarize what the alternative theories could be and a couple of points of evidence for each one. And then a question and answer. And that's pretty much it. It's really straightforward. It's a short PowerPoint of just a few slides and a short presentation of really not more than 10 minutes. So it's very informal. And if you have any questions as you're doing this coming up, feel free to ask me or set up a meeting with me. I'm happy to talk to you about your specific presentation or your specific project and give you pointers or answer any questions. All right, good luck and have a good weekend.